Hey guys, welcome back to another long night in history, where we dim the lights, forget about the day's noise, and drift through the dusty corridors of time to visit people who, frankly, would have had a better night's sleep themselves if revolutions and dynastic drama hadn't barged in on their lives. So grab a blanket, pour some tea, and let's settle in for a story that is very old, very slow, and just tragic enough to be interesting without ever waking you up. Tonight, we begin with the children of the last Russian Tsar, the Romanov kids, those 5 pale, bewildered little monarchs in training who never got their coronations, but certainly got their share of cold Siberian real estate. Now, the Romanovs, like all good royal families, specialized in pageantry, palaces, and truly awkward family portraits where everyone looks like they're about to sneeze. And at the top of it all was Tsar Nicholas II, not exactly history's brightest candle, but he had a wife, Alexandra, who believed fervently in divine right, destiny, and some very questionable mystics with intense beards. And together, they had 5 children. 4 daughters with names that sound like they were plucked straight from a romantic poetry collection: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and 1 son, little Alexei, the long-awaited heir who turned out to have hemophilia, the royal disease that turned even paper cuts into high-stakes medical dramas. Their early lives were a blur of palaces, nannies, French tutors, stiff military uniforms for the boy, and endless embroidery for the girls, because apparently sewing monograms was what passed for excitement if you were a teenage Grand Duchess in pre-revolutionary Russia. They wrote in diaries about the weather, their cats, the occasional sleigh ride, and sometimes about the fact that their father seemed more interested in family picnics than in running the largest country on earth. But in 1917, as war, hunger, and a general dislike for czars boiled over, Nicholas II was politely informed by history itself that his services as an autocrat were no longer required. He abdicated, thinking maybe they'd all retire quietly somewhere nice, perhaps with samovars and sunsets. But revolutions, as it turns out, do not offer generous pension plans. So the entire family, including our 5 drowsy protagonists, were packed off first to a sort of house arrest in their own palace, then to a governor's mansion in the chilly town of Tobolsk in Siberia, which is basically the historical equivalent of being unfollowed by the entire country at once. There, the children passed the time reading, playing the piano, making pressed flowers and scrapbooks, and trying very hard to pretend that the world outside wasn't falling apart like badly glued wallpaper. By 1918, they were moved again, this time to the ominously named House of Special Purpose in Yekaterinburg, which sounds like it should come with secret passageways and a dramatic organ soundtrack, but was really just a former merchant's house with too many soldiers hanging around. The children, still teenagers for the most part, carried their own luggage, slept on army cots, and were allowed brief walks in a small walled garden, while guards whispered about politics, and the locals wondered whether the Romanovs would be sent into exile abroad. Britain was floated as a possibility since King George V was their cousin, but he rather awkwardly declined to invite them over, perhaps realizing that housing deposed monarchs during a wave of European revolutions was a bit like storing fireworks next to a bonfire. So the family waited, their world shrinking to the size of a few upstairs rooms, the children writing increasingly subdued diary entries about the weather, the meals, the small routines of captivity, all under the tired eyes of soldiers who smoked, shuffled cards, and avoided conversation. Then, on a warm July night in 1918, the family was told they were being moved again for their safety, which must have sounded at least mildly hopeful. So down they went into the basement in their nightclothes, the girls carrying little pillows, and the boy pale and unsteady from his illness, and there, instead of the promised transport, they found a firing squad fidgeting in the lamplight. The end, when it came, was quick, confused, and lit by a single bulb swinging on a cord. And the children, who had once sledded through palace courtyards and embroidered initials on handkerchiefs, were no more. Now, you'd think that would be the close of the story, but fallen kingdoms rarely wrap things up neatly. The bodies were taken out into the dark countryside, hurriedly buried, moved, burned, reburied, dug up again, hidden, argued over, identified, misidentified, sanctified, and generally treated with the kind of indecision usually reserved for assembling flat-pack furniture without instructions. For decades, the Romanov children lingered in history like restless characters in a half-forgotten novel, their possessions turning up in museums, their faces staring out of yellowing photographs, while rumors occasionally claimed that Anastasia or Maria had somehow survived, because people do love a maybe-saved princess when reality gets too grim. But no, the revolution had been thorough, and by the time the Soviet Union finally admitted where the graves were, time and weather had done their slow, methodical work. Eventually, the remains were gathered, tested, given an assortment of funerals and memorials, canonized by the church, and placed in ornate coffins under golden domes, because nothing says closure than a belated imperial burial conducted by the descendants of the very system that replaced you. And so the Romanov children, who began life wrapped in silk and titles, ended it in hurried whispers, and then took most of a century to achieve the kind of peace and ceremony they would have taken for granted had history been kinder, or at least better organized. Tonight, as we drift away from their story, it's hard not to picture them frozen forever in those formal photographs, the stiff collars, the enormous bows in the girl's hair, the boy in his sailor suit, like actors in a play that stopped suddenly before the second act, leaving only stillness where the dialogue should have been. Their kingdom fell, their childhood ended, and history, as usual, moved on at its own uneven pace, pausing occasionally to wonder what might have been if revolutions had postponed themselves, if kings had made better choices, if cousins across the continent had been more welcoming. But of course none of that happened, and so the Romanov children belonged to that peculiar gallery of royal offspring who began life with trumpets and ended it with echoes, whose toys and diaries sit in glass cases while tourists shuffle past, whose names are recited in documentaries in voices just like this one, slow, even, nearly sleepy, as though speaking too loudly might wake them after so many years. And now, with their story gently folded away like one of their own embroidered handkerchiefs, we can drift on to the next fallen kingdom, the next set of children who inherited crowns of paper and watched them dissolve in the rain, because history has never been short on young heirs and heiresses left staring at doors that will never open again.
So where were we? Ah yes, the Romanov children, drifting like ghosts through the endless hallways of history, their glittering world smashed into pieces like a Fabergé egg someone dropped off a balcony after one too many vodkas. And yet the story doesn't stop there, because royal children have always been the unfortunate bookmarks in the big, tragic novels of collapsing empires. And after we've watched them shiver in the chill of revolution, we now wander further, slowly, as though the past itself were half asleep, to see what happened to other royal heirs and heiresses when the great crowns of the world toppled from their fathers' and mothers' heads. Because the thing about monarchies is they never seem permanent, until suddenly they're not. And then you've got a gaggle of confused little princes and princesses who are expecting palaces and end up with attics or exile, or worse, convents with very drafty windows. And so as the 20th century stumbled along in its usual chaotic way, we find ourselves drifting over to the Habsburgs, because of course it's always the Habsburgs at some point in these stories. They were basically the Kardashians of European royalty, except with more inbreeding and fewer TV deals. And when their empire finally wheezed its last breath in 1918 after losing a rather large and inconvenient war, the children of Emperor Charles I suddenly went from imperial highnesses to some kids living on handouts in Switzerland, almost overnight. And there's something darkly funny about that, isn't there? How one minute you're practicing how to wave regally from balconies, and the next you're being told to please not run up the heating bill because money is tight, now that you're commoners. Though technically they weren't quite commoners because people still called them archdukes and archduchesses out of habit. But titles without empires are like crowns without heads. Pure decoration, no real use. and little Crown Prince Otto, who was all of 6 years old when the Austro-Hungarian Empire evaporated like spilled beer on a hot day, grew up basically wandering around Europe with his mother Zita, the former empress, who kept insisting he was still the rightful emperor, even though the empire in question no longer existed. Which must have been confusing for Otto, trying to reconcile his mother's imperial pep talks with the fact that they were living in borrowed houses and constantly dodging political enemies. And to be fair, Otto did eventually grow into a reasonably dignified adult who gave long speeches about European unity. But as a child, he was essentially a royal relic. A little boy carrying the full weight of a defunct empire on his tiny shoulders, while also trying to learn his times tables. And you can almost imagine him sitting there over breakfast in some chilly Swiss boarding house, nibbling black bread while Zita explained that technically he was Emperor of Austria-Hungary, King of Hungary, King of Bohemia, King of Croatia, and about 7 other titles. And Otto probably just wanted to go play outside, but instead he got a crash course in how to be the emperor of absolutely nothing, which is a skill a surprising number of royal children had to master in the 20th century, because monarchies were dropping like flies after World War I, leaving behind all these bewildered little ex-princes and ex-princesses like expensive knickknacks nobody knew quite what to do with. And speaking of bewildered children of fallen monarchs, we really should drift back a bit to look at the French, because they practically invented the genre back in 1789 when the Revolution helpfully removed both the monarchy and several royal heads, including Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, leaving behind the so-called lost Dauphin, little Louis Charles, who was all of 8 when they locked him in a tower after executing his parents, which is a fairly extreme form of grounding, even by 18th century standards. And the tragedy of the lost Dauphin became one of those endlessly haunting royal stories, because nobody really knows what happened to him. Officially, he died of illness and neglect a few years later, but of course dozens of imposters popped up over the years claiming to be the grown-up Dauphin, because apparently people in the 19th century had a lot of free time and pretending to be dead royalty was a sort of cottage industry. But the reality is that the poor kid probably wasted away in that tower while Revolutionary Guards drank outside and debated liberty, equality, fraternity, and whether they should bring him slightly moldy bread or not. And you can't help noticing how often royal children became symbols after their parents fell, like little walking propaganda posters for whichever side wanted to use them, because monarchists would sigh over their tragic fates, while revolutionaries insisted they were just ordinary brats now and should get no special treatment. Though, of course, they weren't ordinary at all. They were living reminders of the world that had just been burned down. And people have complicated feelings about reminders, which is why so many royal children after a regime change got quietly shuffled off to convents or distant relatives in other countries where they could grow up out of sight, preferably without inspiring uprisings or pretenders or awkward nostalgia. And this became sort of the standard procedure in Europe. Overthrow monarchy, exile surviving children, wait for them to either marry obscure foreign nobles or die in obscurity, whichever comes first, and the cycle repeats. Though occasionally you got a particularly determined one, like Isabella of Spain's daughter Eulalia, who managed to turn exile into kind of career, writing sarcastic memoirs about the sheer stupidity of European courts, which honestly sounds like a healthy coping mechanism compared to, say, the poor little king of Spain, Francisco II of the Two Sicilies, whose entire kingdom got eaten by Italian unification in the 1860s, leaving him and his relatives wandering around Europe like a traveling circus of ex-monarchs, lugging their titles around in trunks, while real nations got on with real politics. And by now you may have noticed that being the child of a fallen monarch usually meant a life of anticlimax. If you were lucky, you got a quiet exile in some villa with decent wine, and if you weren't lucky, you got a revolutionary tribunal followed by a much shorter life expectancy. Which brings us neatly, if gloomily, back to Russia. Because after the Romanovs fell, the various minor princes and princesses related to them scattered like marbles on a slippery floor, some making it to Paris or London or New York, where they worked as taxi drivers or ballerinas, or in one memorable case, a department store clerk, which must have been quite an adjustment from having titles like Grand Duke or Grand Duchess. And you can picture them folding sweaters in Macy's while distant cousins still address them as Your Imperial Highness, because old habits die hard. And honestly, there's something almost tender about that. The way exiled royalty kept up the little rituals of vanished courts while the rest of the world had completely moved on, like children playing dress-up in clothes that no longer fit. And maybe that's the real theme running through all these stories. Not just loss of power or palaces or even lives, but loss of context. Because royal children were raised in these absurdly elaborate systems of etiquette and hierarchy, taught to believe they were semi-sacred beings destined to rule by divine right, only to have history pull the rug out from under them so thoroughly that one day they were kissing hands in gilded halls and the next they were being told to please not run up the heating bill because money is tight now that you're commoners. Though technically they weren't quite commoners because people still called them archdukes and archduchesses out of habit, but titles without empires are like crowns without heads, pure decoration, no real use. And little Crown Prince Otto, who was all of 6 years old when the Austro-Hungarian Empire evaporated like spilled beer on a hot day, grew up basically wandering around Europe with his mother Zita, the former empress, who kept insisting he was still the rightful emperor, even though the empire in question no longer existed. Which must have been confusing for Otto, trying to reconcile his mother's imperial pep talks with the fact that they were living in borrowed houses and constantly dodging political enemies. And to be fair, Otto did eventually grow into a reasonably dignified adult who gave long speeches about European unity, but as a child, he was essentially a royal relic, a little boy carrying the full weight of a defunct empire on his tiny shoulders while also trying to learn his times tables. And you can almost imagine him sitting there over breakfast in some chilly Swiss boarding house, nibbling black bread while Zita explained that technically he was Emperor of Austria-Hungary, King of Bohemia, King of Croatia, and about 7 other titles. And Otto probably just wanted to go play outside, but instead he got a crash course in how to be the emperor of absolutely nothing, which is a skill a surprising number of royal children had to master in the 20th century, because monarchies were dropping like flies after World War I, leaving behind all these bewildered little ex-princes and ex-princesses like expensive knickknacks nobody knew quite what to do with. And speaking of bewildered children of fallen monarchs, we really should drift back a bit to look at the French, because they practically invented the genre back in 1789 when the Revolution helpfully removed both the monarchy and several royal heads, including Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, leaving behind the so-called Lost Dauphin, little Louis Charles, who was all of 8 when they locked him in a tower after executing his parents, which is a fairly extreme form of grounding, even by 18th century standards. And the tragedy of the Lost Dauphin became one of those endlessly haunting royal stories, because nobody really knows what happened to him. Officially, he died of illness and neglect a few years later, but of course dozens of imposters popped up over the years claiming to be the grown-up Dauphin, because apparently people in the 19th century had a lot of free time and pretending to be dead royalty was a sort of cottage industry. But the reality is that the poor kid probably wasted away in that tower while Revolutionary Guards drank outside and debated liberty, equality, fraternity, and whether they should bring him slightly moldy bread or not. And you can't help noticing how often royal children became symbols after their parents.
And so, as the shadows lengthen over this increasingly crowded exile of dethroned children, we find ourselves wandering further along the echoing corridors of history, where the wallpaper is always peeling and the chandeliers are covered in dust. Because after the Romanovs and the Habsburgs and the Bourbons and the two Sicilies pack up their grounds and head for obscurity, there are still so many more little princes and princesses, stumbling out of collapsing empires like passengers off a sinking ship, some clutching nannies, others clutching titles that will never again mean anything. And you almost want to gather them all together into one enormous boarding school for the suddenly unemployed children of history, though I suspect half of them would insist on being addressed as Your Majesty by the lunch ladies, while the other half would be sulking in corners, writing gloomy poetry about their lost thrones, because that was another favorite pastime of fallen royals, self-pity wrapped in iambic pentameter.
And as we drift through the early 20th century, the cases keep multiplying, like the Ottoman Empire finally giving up the ghost in 1922 after several centuries of staggering around like a very old man at the end of a very long party. And when the last sultan packed his things and sailed off into exile, the entire imperial family suddenly discovered that life without palaces on the Bosphorus was, well, less fun, especially for the children who had grown up expecting eunuchs and diamond-studded cradles, but got apartments in Paris instead. And some of them adapted in surprisingly modern ways, taking jobs, learning trades, even marrying for love, shocking, while others spent the rest of their lives glaring at newspapers and waiting for the people of Turkey to come to their senses and invite them back, which of course never happened, though the nostalgia industry around the Ottoman family has kept a small cottage fire burning ever since. Because people do love a lost empire, don't they? As long as they don't actually have to live under it. And this keeps happening again and again, the same sad operetta with slightly different costumes, like when the Greek monarchy collapsed for the third or fourth time. It's hard to keep count because the Greeks were forever throwing their kings out and then occasionally dragging them back in, like indecisive restaurant goers sending soup back to the kitchen. And each time there were the royal children, staring wide-eyed as the adults around them packed crown jewels into luggage and argued about which cousin in London or Copenhagen might have a spare guest room. Because that's another thing about European royalty. They were all so ludicrously interrelated that exile often just meant moving in with family. Though family in this case might be the King of Denmark or the Queen of Spain or some obscure prince with a castle the size of a garden shed. And you can imagine the awkward family reunions, all these dispossessed royals sitting around comparing revolutions like people compare skiing injuries. Oh, you lost your throne in 22? Ours went up in 18. Absolute nightmare. Pass the jam, please. And somewhere in the corner, a governess is trying to teach the little ex-crown prince his Latin verbs while wondering if her wages will actually arrive this month. And the answer is usually no, because revolutionary governments aren't big on paying royal allowances. So a lot of these children grew up watching their mothers pawn jewelry or sell autographs to tourists, which must have been quite a shock after centuries of everyone insisting their blood was divinely ordained to rule. And what's striking as you wander through all these stories is how often the children themselves turned out perfectly ordinary once the tiaras were taken away. Like some became architects or writers or insurance salesmen, there was literally a Habsburg who ended up selling insurance in Italy. Imagine buying a policy from someone whose ancestors once owned half of Europe, while others spent decades drifting through European society as professional house guests, living off distant cousins and telling long, boring stories about court life before the fall. The kind of people who write very long memoirs nobody reads except grad students. And yet the tragedy was real enough for the children who lost not just luxury but identity. Because when you're raised from birth to believe you are semi-divine, and then history votes otherwise, what exactly are you supposed to do with yourself? Especially if you're 12 or 15, or any age when the world already feels confusing, even without revolutions smashing your destiny to pieces. And so many of them carried that faint air of displacement forever, like the endless line of Romanov cousins who ended up in Paris cafes staring into tiny cups of espresso as if the secrets of the universe might be hiding in the foam. While others fled further afield to places like America, where nobody cared about your Imperial Highness because everyone was too busy inventing jazz and skyscrapers, and the culture shock must have been deliciously painful. Little princes learning to pump their own gas or take the subway, princesses discovering that ordinary people bought their own groceries. And I think that's why so many of them clung to ridiculous fragments of ritual, like insisting on full court etiquette at dinner, even in some rented flat in Brussels with peeling wallpaper. Because when everything else is gone, you hold on to the choreography of the past like it might somehow summon the empire back, though of course it never does. And the 20th century kept grinding forward, utterly indifferent to these stranded heirs wandering through their hotel lobbies and pensione dining rooms, relics of a vanished world carrying titles nobody needed anymore. And by mid-century, the whole spectacle had become faintly comic, like watching actors still in costume after the play is ended and the audience has gone home. But if you look closely, there's always that thread of sadness too, because some of these children remembered palaces in great detail, the marble staircases, the footmen, the endless bowing courtiers, and then lived long enough to die in tiny apartments where the neighbors had no idea they were living next to the former Grand Duke of somewhere or other. And maybe that's why people remain fascinated by them, these leftover children of empire, because they embody both the absurdity of monarchy and the cruelty of history, which sweeps away worlds without the slightest concern for the individuals inside them, even if those individuals once wore crowns the size of small planets. And as we keep drifting forward in this long, drowsy march through the ruins of royal childhoods, we'll find even more scattered heirs blinking in the harsh light of modernity. Some adapting, some refusing, some turning their exile into a kind of performance art, others vanishing into anonymity so completely you could walk past them on the street and never guess they were once destined to rule millions. And this tension between the grandiose expectations of birth and the humiliating realities of history will carry us further still into even stranger corners of the 20th century, where the children of kings and emperors keep colliding with the real world in ways both tragic and faintly ridiculous, because the story, like the exile, just never seems to end.
And so we stumble onward, deeper into the 20th century, where history grows louder and messier, yet somehow always has room for another batch of confused royal offspring blinking at the modern world like owls dragged into daylight. Because even after the great post-World War I collapse of empires, there were still more monarchies wobbling on their thrones like desserts about to slide off a plate. And the children, growing up inside those palaces, had no idea the music was about to stop again. Like in Italy, where the little princes of the House of Savoy probably assumed they'd go on forever, parading around Rome in tiny sailor suits, posing for stiff photographs with their father, the king, while Mussolini hovered in the background like a storm cloud made of fascism and bad decisions. And when the monarchy finally crumbled in 1946, those same children had to pack their things because the Italian people had decided kings were out and republics were in. And off they went into exile like so many before them, swapping palaces for villas, crowns for memories, titles for awkward introductions at cocktail parties. And one can almost picture the young exiled Prince of Naples staring at a plate of spaghetti somewhere in Portugal and wondering how on earth his ancestors had gone from uniting Italy to being politely told to leave it. Because that's the thing about losing a throne. It's never dignified, no matter how many fanfares used to play when you entered a room. And meanwhile, over in Romania, the children of King Michael were watching their own world crack apart under the weight of communism, marching in with its red banners and utter lack of respect for hereditary privilege. And soon enough, they too were scattered across Europe like royal confetti, growing up in Switzerland or Britain or anywhere that would take them, always with that faint air of displaced importance, as though they still half expected people to bow when they entered a bakery. And if you zoom out far enough, you realize the mid-20th century was basically one long eviction notice for monarchies everywhere, each collapse producing its own crop of bewildered young ex-princes and princesses who had been raised to believe they were history's main characters, only to discover they were now footnotes. And perhaps the most cinematic version of this came in Egypt, where King Farouk, that extravagant collector of palaces, cars, and waistlines, was finally kicked out in 1952, taking his family with him, including the little crown prince who had been king for all of 11 months before being dethroned at the age of 1, which must be some kind of record. And after that, the boy grew up in exile with a crown he'd never worn and a kingdom he'd never rule. A living reminder that history can be not only cruel, but downright sarcastic. Because what do you even do with yourself after being king as a toddler? And the answer, apparently, was not much, since he lived quietly in Europe, another royal drifting through cafes and boarding schools, carrying a title like an empty briefcase. And this kept happening everywhere: Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, even little Albania with its hilariously self-important King Zog, who fled in 1939 while his infant son, Leka, would spend decades in exile being raised in various hotels with a crown in his luggage, just in case history changed its mind, which it never did. Though Leka grew up insisting on being called king anyway, because some habits die hard.
And by now, our imaginary boarding school for deposed royal children is bursting at the seams, filled with kids from every fallen dynasty you can name, all eating porridge together while governesses correct their French and the ghosts of lost empires hover in the hallways. And you wonder what they said to each other late at night. Did the exiled prince of Bulgaria swap stories with the exiled crown princess of Greece? Did the little archdukes of Austria-Hungary complain about the plumbing in whatever pension they were stuck in? Did someone organize cricket matches between the Romanovs and the Habsburgs? The mind boggles at the possibilities, though most of these children grew up to lead oddly quiet lives, as though the weight of history had pressed all the energy out of them. And some married commoners, some took jobs, some wrote memoirs nobody reads, and a few spent the rest of their days pretending the crown might still be restored any minute now, keeping little courts in exile alive like embers that never quite go out. But by the 1960s, the world had mostly moved on, caring more about rock stars than royal heirs, about astronauts than archdukes, and the children of fallen kingdoms became a kind of living antique shop, charming in small doses but increasingly irrelevant. Though here and there the old magic still flickered, like when the exiled Greek royal family managed to marry daughters into other European dynasties, producing princesses who turned up at British royal weddings looking glamorous enough to make people forget their family hadn't ruled Greece in decades. And speaking of Britain, it's worth noting how many exiled royals ended up orbiting the British crown like moths around a very shiny flame, because Britain still had its monarchy intact and seemed to collect dispossessed cousins the way some people collect spoons. So Kensington Palace and Buckingham Palace ended up full of faintly shabby relatives from Russia, Greece, Germany, you name it, all with tragic backstories and complicated family trees. And one imagines the young Queen Elizabeth making polite conversation over tea with someone who had once been the crown prince of nowhere in particular before the revolution came. And this is perhaps the strangest thing about the whole saga, how exile turned former emperors and kings into characters at the edge of other people's monarchies, like furniture left over from a previous century, because the modern world simply didn't have much use for them anymore, except as curiosities. And yet they never quite vanished either, because journalists loved to track them down for interviews. Former Tsar's daughter lives modestly in Paris, as though people couldn't resist peeking through the keyhole at what happened after the fairy tale ended. And the answer was, usually, not much, just long lives and comfortable obscurity, punctuated by the occasional nostalgic dinner where everyone still used the old titles, even if the crowns were in storage somewhere. And as the decades rolled on, the children of fallen kingdoms grew old themselves, their memories becoming the last link to vanished worlds of coronations and court balls and uniforms dripping with medals. Until by the end of the century, most of them were gone, leaving behind only photographs, memoirs, and the faint absurdity of having once been told the world was theirs, only to discover it belonged to nobody in particular, least of all to kings. Yet the fascination lingers because we still look at those pictures of little princes and palaces that no longer exist and wonder what they thought as the revolutions closed in, as the cars waited to take them to trains, to ships, to exile, to lives they never expected, carrying history on their small shoulders like luggage far too heavy for children to bear.
And yet as the century lumbered on, history having chewed up the old empires and spat out republics like orange seeds, there remained this peculiar diaspora of royal children turned middle-aged men and women, wandering through the back corridors of the 20th century like extras who had once been promised starring roles, because though the palaces had been taken and the crowns locked away in museums or pawn shops or family vaults, the titles clung to them like perfume that wouldn't wash off, so you could have entire dinner parties in Madrid or London or Geneva where half the guests were exiled princes of places that no longer existed, sipping soup under chandeliers and swapping stories about lost thrones as though they'd misplaced a set of car keys rather than entire kingdoms. And it was at one of these gatherings, so legend has it, that someone asked the former King Simeon of Bulgaria what it felt like to have been a monarch at the age of 6, dethroned at 9, exiled at 10, and yet somehow still addressed as Your Majesty while queuing at banks in Spain. And he reportedly shrugged in that European way, suggesting life was absurd, but the wine was excellent. Because what else could he say when history had turned his life into a riddle with no punchline? And meanwhile, the Greek royal family kept producing photogenic children, as though monarchy might return any minute now, marrying them off to Scandinavian princes or British cousins, so that by the late 20th century there was this entire invisible web of deposed royals attending each other's weddings like a traveling circus of tiaras, everyone dancing in ballrooms while back in their supposed homelands nobody particularly wanted them back, because by now Greece had airports and pop music and military coups to worry about. Bulgaria had communism and then the chaos after communism. Romania had Ceausescu and then revolution. Italy had the mafia and bad traffic. And the idea of restoring kings felt about as modern as bringing back the guillotine, though that didn't stop a few hopeful monarchists from waving banners at rallies now and then, declaring that the prince in exile would return in glory, while the prince himself usually preferred playing tennis or managing investments in Switzerland, because reality has a way of dulling even the sharpest fantasies. And speaking of fantasies, none were stranger than the Albanian royal saga, where young Leka, son of the flamboyant King Zog, grew up convinced he would one day reclaim his father's throne, despite spending most of his life in Africa, running a chicken farm and stockpiling weapons like some Balkan James Bond. So that when communism finally fell in Albania, and he actually returned in the 1990s, the poor man arrived in full military uniform, carrying a crown in his luggage, only to find the country politely declined his offer of monarchy, voting instead for a republic, while Leka stood on the balcony of a hotel shouting about destiny to a crowd that mostly wanted better electricity rather than royal restoration. And one almost feels sorry for him, because the 20th century kept dangling hope in front of these exiled children, only to snatch it away again, like when Simeon of Bulgaria actually became prime minister in 2001. Yes, the same little boy king from the 1940s returned not as monarch, but as elected politician in a twist so ironic it could have been written by history's drunkest playwright. And for a while he governed Bulgaria in a suit, rather than a crown, proving, perhaps, that exile teaches pragmatism if nothing else. And yet even then the monarchy stayed dead, because modern nations rarely resurrect things they've already buried, especially crowns, except in the occasional sentimental documentary, showing black and white footage of tiny princes waving from palace balconies before the revolutions came, set to sad violin music, which always makes people sigh about the lost elegance of the past without actually wanting it back. Because let's be honest, most monarchies collapsed for very good reasons, involving incompetence, extravagance, or a general inability to notice angry mobs gathering outside. And the children who inherited those disasters spent their lives drifting between nostalgia and normalcy. Some fading quietly into the suburbs, others popping up at charity galas wearing sashes nobody recognized, all carrying that peculiar air of people born to destinies that evaporated before they were old enough to spell them. And perhaps the saddest were the Romanovs, who survived the 1917 catastrophe, scattered across Europe like autumn leaves, their descendants growing up in Paris apartments or American towns with names like Olga or Tatiana that hinted at old Russia but led mostly to ordinary lives teaching French or selling insurance. Because exile is boring after the first few years, no matter how imperial your bloodline. And by the time the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, the idea of restoring a czar was about as practical as restoring the dinosaurs, though a few dreamy monarchists muttered about the Romanov heir somewhere in Spain or wherever he lived by then, while ordinary Russians were busy surviving the 1990s with little interest in crowns except as jewelry. And so the royal children of the 20th century aged into royal grandparents of the 21st century, still carrying titles like luggage tags from journeys that ended long ago, appearing at the occasional wedding or funeral where journalists dutifully listed their defunct kingdoms in italics, Prince so-and-so of former such-and-such, until even the italics felt embarrassed, because nothing ages faster than yesterday's monarchy. And yet, curiously, people remain fascinated by them, these wandering relics of history, perhaps because they remind us how quickly power can vanish, how a child in a gilded nursery can grow up to sell real estate in Canada, or run a ski school in Austria, or give interviews about palaces you barely remembers, as though history itself enjoys watching its former darlings learn humility one airline ticket at a time. And maybe that's why the story of fallen kingdoms and their offspring refuses to die, why documentaries keep getting made, why books keep being written. Because somewhere in those photographs of tiny princes clutching toy swords while revolutions brewed outside lurks the universal truth that nothing lasts, not crowns, not empires, not even the illusion of permanence. And the children who once toddled through throne rooms now rest in cemeteries far from the lands that once sang their anthems, leaving behind only legends, memoirs, and the faint echo of titles that meant everything until, quite suddenly, they meant nothing at all.